If I may please have your attention. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Katie Chow. I'm a Dean's Ambassador for the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and I will be serving as the MCs for today's special event. This special event marks the next installment of the UCR Provost's lecture series, as well as the UCR School of Public Policy's 10-year anniversary quarterly series. We will begin tonight with some introductory remarks by the Dean and Provost. Afterwards, we will welcome our special guest speaker for a lecture. Then in the last 15 minutes or so of the event, we will transition to an audience Q&A session. And afterwards, please stick around for a reception, which will be held at the back of the venue. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce Dean Mark Long. Dr. Mark Long began his role as Dean of the UCR School of Public Policy in January of 2023. Previously, he was the Professor of Public Policy and Governance, as well as the Adjunct Professor of Economics at the University of Washington. He served as the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance's Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Associate Dean for Research. And prior to that, he served as the George Washington University as an Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy and Administration. Dean Long holds a PhD and Master's in Economics, as well as an MPP from the University of Michigan. He also holds a secondary teaching credential via UCLA and a Bachelor's in Studio Art from DePaul University. So please join me in welcoming Dean Long to the stage.
Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see such a nice big audience. I understand we even have an overflow audience room downstairs, so that's a really great result to see so many folks coming in. So, as many of you know, this year the School of Public Policy is proud to celebrate our 10th anniversary. We've been hosting a series of events that have featured discussion about how public policy can create a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world. Jens's work is highly diverse and impactful, fits into this theme. He's been exploring how public policy shapes individuals from childhood through young adulthood and seeks to identify how we can intervene to improve outcomes. So in preparation for this event, I was looking at Google Scholar to see what have been the most cited works of Jens's. And they're very diverse, but fit into a few buckets. One group is on includes papers titled Human Decisions and Machine Predictions, Prediction Policy Problems, and Discrimination in the Age of Algorithms. These papers answer the following questions. Can machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence, improve human decision-making? For example, can we help judges make decisions by predicting the likelihood that a defendant will commit future crimes? And can these algorithms help us in detecting discrimination? As it turns out, I'll be teaching a course for students in the audience. I'll be teaching a course in the winter of next year on prediction for public policy problems, and this class will strongly feature Jens's scholarship in this area. A second group of Jens's papers focuses on the effects of childhood education, specifically looking at things like, does Head Start improve children's life chances? Evidence from a regression discontinuity design. Investing in our future, the evidence based on preschool education. And in these papers, Jens finds that Head Start lowers children's mortality rates and raises their educational attainment. A third set of Jens's papers, which maybe is a little bit more relevant for today's talk, focuses on the effects of neighborhood quality on later life outcomes. This set includes neighborhoods, obesity, and diabetes, a randomized social experiment. Neighborhoods' effects on crime for female and male youth, evidence from a randomized housing voucher experiment. And urban poverty and juvenile crime, evidence from a randomized housing mobility experiment. Finally, neighborhood effects on long-term well-being of low-income adults. In that paper, he and his co-authors find a 1 standard deviation decline in neighborhood poverty, which is 13 percentage points, increases subjective well-being by amount equal to the gap in subjective well-being between people whose annual incomes differ by $13,000. Which is a large amount given that the average for the control group income was $20,000. So this ability to move to these higher quality neighborhoods had these large scale effects on subjective well-being. I'm thrilled that Jens is willing to come to UCR and present his recent work with us today. Now it's my honor to introduce Provost Watkins. I want to thank Provost Watkins for initiating this lecture series and inviting the School of Public Policy to nominate a speaker for it. And she'll talk about what this lecture series is all about. So, Provost Watkins.
Thank you, Dean Long. How cool is it that I have my own lecture series? Who knew that that would happen when I became provost? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. It is just so great to see this room fully packed, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the second event in this recently established Provost Lecture Series. I want to extend a special welcome to our guest of honor, Dr. Jens Ludwig. Jens, thank you so much for traveling all the way from Chicago to be with us today. We're really honored to have you on the campus. I'm excited to hear your talk. I'm also grateful to Dean Long and his colleagues in the School of Public Policy for bringing such a distinguished voice to our campus through their nomination of Dr. Ludwig. And I just want to stop here and give thanks to all the members of the School of Public Policy who've put on this event, from finding the room and hosting the reception and working out the AV. So can we give the students and staff a round of applause? Now, in addition to this Provost Lecture Series, as Dean Long just mentioned, today's gathering is also part of the School of Public Policy's 10-year anniversary celebration. Over the past decade, the school has become a prolific hub for research that shapes our community. And I can think of no better way to mark that impact than with the conversation we are about to have. When I established the Provost Lecture Series earlier this year, I did so with a very specific vision in mind. I wanted to create a platform for the most distinguished minds in the nation to engage directly with the UC Riverside community. By bringing members of our nation's most elite national academies to our campus, we're fostering a new level of conversation and collaboration. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the 5 academies, they are the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Our first lecture was held in February, and this featured Dr. Sujay Liu, who is president of the National Academy of Engineering. And today we continue that momentum with Dr. Ludwig, who is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and how fortunate that we are here in our School of Medicine to celebrate that. To the faculty and students who are here today, the goal of this series extends beyond the lecture itself. We're here to foster meaningful engagement, to spark new networks, encourage high-level collaboration, and amplify the work that you're doing right here at UCR. I've asked the speakers in this series to step outside the bounds of a traditional research seminar. Our goal is to hit sort of an intellectual sweet spot, a discourse that is rigorous enough for peer scholars, yet accessible enough to inspire those in different disciplines. This series is not just for our campus, it's also for our broader community. I'm delighted to see some members of our community here with us this afternoon. In a world that feels increasingly fragmented, public universities remain a sanctuary for collective inquiry. It's here that we explore the frontiers of technological innovation, the evocative power of the arts, and the complex societal issues that require our shared attention. And few challenges are as defining or as urgent as the one that Dr. Ludwig will discuss today, gun violence. His work challenges us to look beyond the headlines and traditional narratives to see the data and the human behavior underneath. It's a privilege to host a conversation that demands such intellectual honesty and rigorous inquiry. I'm very much looking forward to the lecture and to your questions and the discussion that will follow. Thank you all for being part of this new tradition at UCR, and I will now turn things back to Katie.
Great. Thank you so much, Provost Watkins. I'm now delighted to bring Dr. Sharon Oslin, who will introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Oslin is a professor of public policy and sociology here at UCR. She joined the university in 2014, and in 2018, she became the director of the Presley Center of Crime and Justice Studies, which is housed in the School of Public Policy. As a principal investigator on center projects, Dr. Oslin has carried out research that includes evaluations of certain policies and initiatives related to reentry in the state of California. She continues to pursue research on crime, the criminal legal system, prisoner reentry, illicit markets in urban spaces, and more. Her work is published as a book in the New York University Press and in top sociological and criminological journal outlets. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Oslin to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored today to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Jens Ludwig. He is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, where he is also Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab. Dr. Ludwig is also the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Working Group on the Economics of Crime and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, as Provost Watkins already mentioned. He started the Crime Lab 18 years ago to serve as the R&D partner to the public sector to help solve some of society's most difficult policy challenges. The Crime Lab's work has changed public policy at scale in Chicago, New York, and other cities across the country, with results published in leading peer-reviewed scientific journals across multiple disciplines and featured in national news outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and PBS NewsHour. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ludwig to the stage.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a terrific honor to be here. I have so many longtime friends and colleagues on campus, Mark Long, Kurt Schwabe, who I've known for 30-something years. What I wanted to do is maybe start off with a couple of minutes of why I wrote this book. So I was on the faculty at Georgetown University for 12 years before I moved to the University of Chicago in 2007. So if you're doing the math, you're wondering to yourself, how can someone who looks like they're 18 have been a professor for so long? That'll just be one of the great mysteries of social science that we will leave hanging out there. And the fall that I got there to the university, so Amadeus is a doctoral student in chemistry. He is defending his dissertation that fall. So 6 or 7 years before I get to campus, his family is home in Senegal. They get a letter from the University of Chicago Graduate School that says, your kid has a full ride. This is something I didn't know. I'm a first-generation college goer myself. This is something that I didn't know until I went to get a PhD myself. You don't pay to get a PhD, they pay you. And it turns out that the University of Chicago's chemistry department is one of the very best chemistry departments in the whole world. So this kid's home with his family in Senegal. They get a letter from the graduate school of the University of Chicago. Your kid is getting a full ride to one of the very best chemistry PhD programs in the entire world. This is as close to the real life version of a Willy Wonka golden ticket as it gets. So he gets on a plane, he flies to Chicago, he lands at O'Hare, 10 hours of Chicago traffic later, he arrives in Hyde Park. That's just a little Chicago traffic joke. He does amazingly well in the, sorry, do you want to, I'll move so you can, oh, you can, okay, perfect, great, yeah, perfect, thanks, great. So if you could change, if you could advance one for, oh, perfect. Oh, maybe that'll work for me here. Okay. So this is Amadou. He defends his dissertation that fall. And 2 weeks after he defends, he's coming home from an ice cream social at 1:30 in the morning. His apartment building is about a block from my office at the University of Chicago on the south side of the Midway, if you've ever been to the University of Chicago campus. And someone comes up to him to rob him of his backpack and his water bottle. And I don't know if he reflexively resisted or if the backpack just accidentally got caught on his shoulder or what happened. But the guy who was robbing him wound up shooting him point blank in the chest with a stolen .22. Emergency medical services come and they race him northbound on Lakeshore Drive to the Northwestern University ER downtown in the Streeterville neighborhood where he's pronounced dead. So I say that for a couple of different reasons. For starters, just to remind us that behind every statistic and every news headline, there's a mom who's lost the most important person in their life. And in this particular case, the guy who shot Amadou was an 18-year-old kid named Demetrius Warren, who's now spending, I think he's spending 150 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections. In this case, two moms lost the most important person in their life. Okay, so if you could advance one more. So this is Amadusis, and then advance one more, please. Great. So a bunch of deans then start running around trying to think about what the University of Chicago could be. You know, we like to go around saying we've won more Nobel Prizes than any other university in the world, and yet we can see here we haven't had nearly as much impact as we should, literally in our own backyard. So most universities, when they want to be helpful to their home place, they round up 5 undergraduates and they send them out to tutor at a local elementary school, which is great, but seems so inadequate relative to the scale of the problem. And so this is actually very fitting given the theme of the Provost's lecture. Just a few years before this happened, the National Academy of Sciences had commissioned a blue ribbon group, some of the smartest criminologists in the country, to review all of the data and the evidence that we have about what we know about preventing gun violence in America. 350-page report comes out in 2004. The conclusion is nothing. We know absolutely nothing that will actually be useful that you could tell a mayor about what to do to solve this problem. Okay. And so one of the assistant dean types came to me and said, what do you think we should do? I said, that to me seems like the sort of problem that a research university should be trying to solve. And so our idea was, the National Academy of Sciences has just told us that the government, with its vast scope and resources, they have no idea what they're doing. We know how to use, we don't have the capacity to do anything, but we have the capacity to use data and do research and try and understand problems and potentially identify some solutions. And so I said, why don't we start this research center called the Crime Lab at the University of Chicago to sort of be an R&D partner to local government in Chicago. Maybe we find something that's helpful to all the other cities around the country which are struggling with Chicago-like problems, which is to say every other city around the country. Okay, so if you could advance one more. Great. And then one more, please. So, the other kind of thing that I wanted to say, so what the book is basically is, it is a summary of what I think we've learned in doing this sort of work in Chicago for the last 18 years in close partnership with city government and all the nonprofits that the city government funds to work on this problem. And doing this sort of work, we could see our partners on the ground were seeing the problem in a way that felt very different from what I would see talking to other academics, reading the news, listening to presidential debates about what to do about the problem. And so the book basically summarizes what we've learned from that partnership and tries to connect a bunch of ideas that on their face seem very different, connect them with some sort of conceptual framework that hopefully makes you see that all of this, I think, is connected through some sort of coherent whole. Okay. The one other sort of stage setting thing that I want to do before we start is to point out that this problem is really unique to America among the rich countries of the world. So this shows you the homicide rate per 100,000 for developed countries around the world. This is the United States. You can see I made this graph up myself. It's incompetently labeled. All the graphs that look good, I had help with. This one I did myself without adult chaperone, as you can see. So the US bar is at the left, and you can see that the murder rate in the United States is off the charts compared to other rich countries, even other developed countries that you don't think of as being particularly well run, like Turkey. People in Turkey are looking at news headlines for the US and thinking, what in the world is going on over there? Really quite a statement, right? And then if you forward one more, and the other thing that you can see that's very relevant here is you can divide the murder rate per capita in these countries into murders committed with guns and murders committed without guns. And you can see almost all of the American exceptionalism is driven by gun murders. Okay, if you go one more, please. Here's why that's such a problem. Here's why that's such a problem. So if you look at the distribution of crimes that police find out about in the United States, overwhelmingly, the number of crimes that we see in America overwhelmingly are property crimes. And then most of the rest of the crimes are different sorts of violent crimes, mostly assaults, some robberies. The most serious gun crime, homicide, we just saw most homicides in the US are committed with guns. They're 1/5 of 1% of all the crimes that police find out about, right? So sometimes I hear people in Chicago say some version of, why is it always murders on the front page of the Chicago Tribune that we are paying so much attention to? It's just such a tiny share of the crime problem. Well, economists over time have developed ways of measuring the social impact of different policy problems. We started off doing this for environmental problems, and we can do this for crime as well. We can measure the social burden of different types of problems as the public conceives of it. And when you look at the social harm of crime, if you advance one more, if you look at the social harm of crime, murder, which is 1/5 of 1% of all crimes, accounts for 70% of the public's concern about crime. So from the public's perspective, the crime problem in America is the gun violence problem, right? And that is the one area where we really are off the charts compared to every other country. Okay, so if you go one more, please. So what I want to argue, what I want to try and convince you of is that we haven't made more progress on this problem because we framed the problem incorrectly. Just also to calibrate expectations, this is about as funny as economics humor gets. So if you don't like this, it is not going to get any better as we go. So I want to argue that we've been framing the problem incorrectly, and if we can see it differently, it turns out to be much more solvable than I think we've long thought. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. And one more. Perfect. And so at a high level, I think the problem is, and one more, please. At a high level, here's what I think the problem is in our thinking. We've been thinking about the problem too much like these guys. This is Milton Friedman at the top and Gary Becker underneath them. And if you've taken an economics class, you will realize that one of their big contributions to human thought is to argue that people are always super optimizing rational benefit cost calculators, right? And that's how we've thought about this gun violence problem for a long time. And if you advance one more, what I want to argue is that we really need to be thinking about the problem of gun violence much more like this guy. This is Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics, who basically argued that people are people. Right? People are not like what Gary Becker or often not what Gary Becker and Milton Friedman would have argued. Okay, yeah, we can go one more, please. Great. So how have we been framing this problem historically? So if you think back to this slide that I showed you, many of you are probably thinking, I know exactly what's going on, right? Just look at the US graph, look at the United Kingdom graph right next to it. The United Kingdom has very strict gun laws, certainly strict relative to the United States. They have very few guns per capita, certainly compared to the United States, where we have something like 400 or 500 million guns in a country of 330 million people, right? The United Kingdom has a far lower murder rate, almost no murders committed with guns. Isn't this story just one of gun regulation and gun availability? Okay. And there's definitely something to that argument, right? So in principle, the effect of having more guns out in circulation, what that should do to the crime and homicide problem is conceptually ambiguous. So when more people have guns, in principle, that means that more people have guns to use in self-defense, which itself could then generate a deterrent effect against criminal attack as well. So that force could reduce injury, but there's a countervailing force as well, which is that when you have more guns in circulation, guns are more likely to be involved in crime, which can make crime more lethal. So then it's an empirical question, which of these countervailing forces dominates. And it turns out that the instrumentality effect, guns making crime more lethal, winds up dominating the deterrent effect of guns. Right. So I say that because when I say countries with more guns in circulation have higher murder rates, I want to make clear that is not a political or ideological statement. That's an empirical statement. That need not have been true. It turns out to be true. That's what the data seems to suggest. So guns are definitely an important part of the story. But what I want to convince you of is that that's not the entire story. So if you advance one more slide. Okay. And to try and convince you of that, I want to take you on sort of a virtual tour of the South Side. Imagine that you're at the University of Chicago's public policy building. It won't be this nice. It's mid-April, so it's probably snowing, right, or sleeting, something like that right now. We'd be walking out of the Harris School building at the University of Chicago on the 60th Street on the South Side. We'd make a right heading eastbound towards the lake. We'd go 2 blocks to Dorchester Avenue. We'd make a right on Dorchester. We'd go almost exactly 1 mile south on Dorchester, and we'd hit 71st Street, where this place is located. So if you advance one more, this place is called Easy Tree Recycling, and their slogan is, "A tree is a terrible thing to waste." So what's interesting about Easy Tree Recycling? So if you click one more, and then one more, please. So this is Dorchester Avenue, this is Easy Tree, and right there at 71st Street, if you click one more, please. Right there at 71st and Dorchester, that is the dividing line between 2 Chicago neighborhoods, South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing. Okay, Greater Grand Crossing to the west, South Shore to the east, 2 neighborhoods right across the street from one another. If you advance one more, please. And here's the interesting thing about Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. So if you advance one more. So I'm plotting here the shooting rate per capita year over year in these 2 neighborhoods. And you can see that pretty consistently, the per capita rate of shootings in Greater Grand Crossing is about twice what you see in South Shore. Now, here's what's interesting about that. So if you advance one more, and one more, and one more. Here's what's exactly the same. Here's what's exactly the same in Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore is the gun laws. Exactly same city gun laws, state gun laws, federal gun laws. Now, if you know something about gun control or gun violence, then you'll be thinking to yourself, well, I know that one of the big problems with gun violence in America is very few of the crime guns in a strict jurisdiction place like Chicago are actually from Chicago. They're all driven in from Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama. True, but guess what? It is just as easy to drive from the Cabellos in Hammond, Indiana, which is one of the top 5 crime gun sources in Chicago, just as easy to drive from Hammond, Indiana over to South Shore as it is to Greater Grand Crossing. Okay, so everything about the gun environment is exactly the same. And yet we're seeing not a small difference in gun violence, not a small difference, a fully doubling of the shooting rate per capita in one neighborhood compared to right across the street. So if you go one more, please. So here's the first, I think, this is the sort of high level insight that you fly someone in from Chicago for, right here. Gun violence equals guns plus violence. It's actually a much more useful, I think, frame than you might initially think. So if you click one more. So if the gun environment is exactly the same in these 2 neighborhoods, okay, which it is, and if you click one more, and so if the gun environment is the same and the rate of gun violence is so dramatically different, then one more, please, then it has to be the case that the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another has to independently account for a huge amount of the variation in what we're seeing in gun violence, right? So this actually is a super optimistic perspective on the problem of gun violence in America, right? If you walked in here thinking that the only thing that we can do about gun violence in America is get rid of the 400 to 500 million guns in America or enact sweeping national gun laws, whatever your personal political views are about that, that is unlikely to happen anytime soon. So you'd be sitting here feeling super depressed about our ability to make progress on this problem. The good news is that we have a whole other margin that we can then think about acting on potentially to make progress on the problem. Okay, so go one more, please. And one more. Okay, so then and one more. so then that raises a different sort of question. Okay, so now we're just sort of pushing back the layers of questions where it's like, okay, so if the willingness of people to use guns to hurt one another is a big part of the story, that just pushes back the question of like, why are people doing that? We have to be able to answer that question then if we want to make progress on the problem. So how have we been thinking about violent behavior? So for this book, I spent a huge amount of time trying to track down literally every opinion survey of Americans I could find that asked people, why do you think people commit crimes, commit violent crimes? And the survey data and the focus groups are very, very clear, The overwhelming majority of Americans believe one of two conventional wisdoms. These are going to be very familiar to you. So a huge segment of America thinks that the problem of violent crime is morally bad people who are just not afraid of whatever the criminal justice system is going to do to them. And under that perspective, you conclude that the only thing that you can do to prevent violent crime and gun violence is to threaten people with bigger criminal justice sticks. Right. Most people who don't believe that believe a different conventional wisdom, which is no, gun violence is actually due to economically desperate people who are going to do whatever it takes to feed themselves and their families. And under that perspective, you conclude the only thing that you can do to prevent the gun violence problem is to make the alternatives to crime more lucrative, to lure people away from criminal behavior so they don't engage in violence then. Okay. So if you go one more, please. So guess what else turns out to be the same in these two neighborhoods? One more, please. The criminal justice system is exactly the same in Greater Grand Crossing and South Shore. The same Chicago Police Department, District 3 even overlaps the two neighborhoods. Same Cook County court system, same prosecutors, same judges, same Illinois Department of Corrections, same everything. Okay, one more, please. Turns out that the poverty rate in these two neighborhoods is exactly the same, and one more. And the level of racial segregation and social isolation in the two neighborhoods, the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhoods are almost identical. Okay, so this is not to say that conventional wisdom is all wrong, but it is for sure to say that conventional wisdom is deeply, deeply incomplete. Everything that people have been talking about and arguing about cannot explain something as basic as why one neighborhood has fully twice the number of shootings per capita as their neighborhood right across the street. There is a huge amount of unexplained variation in this problem. And if we can understand what that is, maybe we can do something about it. Okay, and one more, please. The other thing about this conventional wisdom that I would just mention is these two quotes that I gave you are from the Republican and Democrat presidential candidates in the 1930s. We have been having this same conversation for 100 years, and this has been a road to nowhere. Okay, one more, please. If you look at, so this is fitting that we're in the medical school here at University of California, Riverside. The mortality rates from most leading causes of death have been plummeting in the United States over time, right? Life expectancy hasn't quite doubled, but it's nearly doubled since 1900. And yet the murder rate in the United States today is almost exactly the same as it was in 1950 and all the way back to 1900. So no long-term progress. And I would also just mention, I don't think I've got this graph with me here today, unfortunately, but the other thing that we've done at the Crime Lab is we've broken out trends in murder rates over time by neighborhood, racial and ethnic composition in Chicago. So like one thing that people in Chicago like to say is, well, at least the city's way safer today than it was back in the early 1900s at the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic. If you live in a predominantly white neighborhood in Chicago, for sure that's true. If you live in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood in Chicago, that's kind of true. If you live in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Chicago, it is not at all obvious that's true. The murder rate in the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Chicago today is not that different from what it was at the peak of the crack cocaine epidemic 30 whatever years ago, right? And I mention that because we spend a lot of time in the United States talking about rising inequality in income, rising inequality in wealth, rising inequality in access to educational opportunity, for good reason, right? For good reason. We spend a lot less time talking about inequality in something that's even more important in the lives of low-income people in America, which is basic safety. And that is a form of inequality that is massively widening. And raise your hand if you have seen a front-page New York Times story about that anytime soon. Right. Okay, one more, please. Okay, so I want to argue that we need a new way to see the problem, and to think about what that new way of seeing the problem is. I want to just point out that these two conventional wisdoms that we have in the United States for the last 100 years, as different as they are, share an implicit underlying assumption here, right? So if you think that the solution to the gun violence problem is to threaten people with bigger criminal justice sticks to deter them, or if you think the solution to the gun violence problem is like more generous jobs and social programs, like bigger carrots to lure people away from crime, you implicitly think that before anyone pulls a trigger, they're engaging in kind of a rational Gary Becker, Milton Friedman benefit cost calculation in their head. You think that this problem is deliberate, intentional, premeditated. You have to think that if you think your solution to the problem is changing incentives, right? And that, I think, is where we've gone massively sideways. Okay, so if you go one more, please. So we have misunderstood the problem of gun violence in America, is what I want to argue. And so when we think of carrots and sticks, I think what we have in mind is like The Wire. We imagine that the gun violence problem is driven by hierarchical gangs that are engaging in gun violence for instrumental reasons, where the violence is a means to some other end. I want to take over, I'm Marlo Stansfeld's gang, and I want to take on Avon Barksdale's drug-selling corners, right? The violence is, or this is robbery related, I'm trying to get someone's phone in their wallet, whatever it is, right? That's what we imagine it to be. That is not what most gun violence in America actually is. So this is a more or less randomly selected shooting taken from the Chicago Tribune from a few years ago. This also happened pretty close to my office at the University of Chicago. June 2nd, 2012, it's a Saturday at 3 in the afternoon. There are two groups of teenagers in the middle of the street at 73rd and Coles Avenue, arguing about whether a kid in one of the groups stole a bike from a kid in one of the other groups. Two groups start to separate, so there's no self-defense rationale for what happens next, which is one of the teenagers pulls a 9mm semi-automatic from their waistband, fires into the other group, hits another teenager in the chest. EMS comes, races that kid northbound on Lakeshore Drive to the exact same Northwestern Emergency Department where Amadou Sis was declared dead. They declare this kid dead as well. Okay. Now, if you go one more, please. Just look at this and ask yourself. Look at this and ask yourself, does this look like rational, optimizing, benefit cost calculating behavior to you? Right, so one more, please. If you go to Facebook or Etsy or whatever on the south side of Chicago, if you can get $50 for your used bike on the south side of Chicago, you are doing really well, right? And even in a city like Chicago with let me be diplomatic and say not ideal criminal justice system, even in Chicago with a not ideal criminal justice system, you shoot someone in broad daylight on a crowded street, you've got at least a 50% chance of getting caught. It turns out that the shooter did get caught. He's spending 60 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections, right? So if you go one more and one more, who in the world would knowingly flip this coin? Heads, $50 used bike, tails, 60 years downstate in the Illinois Department of Corrections. You are not valuing your time very highly if you are willing to flip that coin. It makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so if we go one more, okay. This is what the data show very clearly. This is what most gun violence in America is. So these instrumental murders, gang wars, robberies, they definitely happen, right? but that's only about 1 in 5 of all murders in Chicago, and the national data tells us the same thing for the US as a whole. Overwhelmingly, the gun violence and the homicides in the United States are arguments that spiral out of control and end in tragedy because someone's got a gun, or it's retaliation for some past conflict, right? That is the gun violence problem. And the reason that nobody sees it is, for the book, I had my RAs do a media content analysis, right? So once in a while, tragically, there will be like a college kid in Chicago at one of our universities shot and killed. That is a national or international news story, right? When the US attorney does a racketeering case against a drug selling gang, right? The wicked vice lords, or the wicked traveling vice lords on the West Side, they just had a big federal case that was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune every day for like 2 weeks. That is what gets massive over coverage in the papers relative to its share of the problem. 2 guys get in an argument at bar, walk outside, one guy shoots the other guy. That is like page A56, and it's 1 sentence, right? So that is not our impression of the problem, but that is the problem. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to make progress on this problem, we have to understand, why in the world is this happening? Okay, so if we go one more. All right, so when I had control, sorry, let me just try one more time. No, this isn't going to work. Oh, wait, does it work? Okay, all right, great. All right, so let's see if this works now. So I have found through trial and error, I think the best way to illustrate this different perspective on the problem, maybe it was just user error by me before, who knows? I think that would be the Occam's razor explanation, actually. I think that the best way that I found to explain this different perspective we've got on the gun violence problem is through a little audience participation exercise. Okay, so we'll see if this works with this audience. Let's see if this works, if I can work a clicker. So here's the way it's going to work. I'm going to show you a colored object, and I want you to call out the color of the object that you see in the center of the slide. Okay, ready? We'll do a little practice run for starters. Okay, ready? Okay, forgive me for saying so, especially in front of your provost, but that was pathetic. You can do much, much better than that. It's only going to work if everybody's really into this, and I'm going to go really fast, okay? So you got the instructions. Here we go. Okay. So what is that? What is that? So if you've taken a psychology class, you will recognize that as something called the Stroop test. Okay, it's one of the most widely used tests in all, or experiments in all of psychology. So what is the Stroop test illustrating? What is the Stroop test illustrating? The Stroop test is illustrating what I have come to think of as the most important insight that social science has given us for the last 50, 75 years, in my view. And what is that insight? It's so much better with a clicker. This is great. That insight is that our minds do not work the way that we think they do. Okay? Your own mind is nothing like you imagine. When you think of thinking, you think of the little voice in your head, right? And to the extent to which you are ever deliberate, rational, premeditated, whatever, it is that little voice in your head that gives you the capacity to do that, right? Psychologists call that rational thinking or system 2 thinking, if you've read the wonderful Danny Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That kind of thinking is very, very powerful, but it's very, very mentally exhausting, right? So every morning in Chicago, we're one of the 6 households in Chicago that still gets the newspaper. So every morning my wife comes down, she gets her coffee, she opens up the newspaper, and she starts to do the crossword or the Wordle or whatever it is that she does. And after 15 minutes, she's exhausted, she's got to take a break, right? That is your deliberate self burning through your mental bandwidth very, very quickly. That is so exhausting that our minds have developed in a way that we do as little of that as possible. That is just a tiny, tiny share of what our minds are doing. The overwhelming majority of what our minds do happens below the level of consciousness. You're not even aware of it. It's a series of automatic responses that we have developed because they're useful for helping us navigate common situations that we see over and over again. They're adaptive to these common situations that we see, right? And these automatic, psychologists call this system one thinking or intuitive thinking. These automatic responses, they're fast, they're effortless, they happen below the level of consciousness. How many doors have you opened today? You have no idea. The answer is not zero because you're here. That's system one at work, right? You could not live without system one, but nothing in life is free, right? The price that you pay for outsourcing so much of your cognition to this fast, effortless part of your mind that happens below the level of consciousness is accuracy. System one gets it right most of the time, but not all the time. And I want to argue that the problem of gun violence is driven by these normally useful system one automatic responses that can be overgeneralized. That's what the Stroop test is illustrating, right? So what is the Stroop test illustrating? Here's a common situation that you see all the time. See word, read word, right? So I got here a little early. I'm walking around in your amazing Southern California weather. One of the most shocking things to me was how many people are in UC Riverside sweatshirts. Come to the University of Chicago, you don't see anyone. And I don't know what that says about Riverside and the University of Chicago, but everybody's wearing their UCR swag, right? I see someone's sweatshirt. I don't have the little voice in my head pop up and say, should I read what's on that person's sweatshirt? I just automatically, almost involuntarily read it. That is super, think about how exhausting you would be if every time you saw someone's sweatshirt, the little voice in your head said, should I read what's... And what the Stroop test is showing you is that normally useful automatic response can get you into trouble when it's overgeneralized into an out of the ordinary situation. And the Stroop test is creating that sort of out of the ordinary situation and showing you what we have done is we have put the instructions that your system two is supposed to follow in direct conflict with this system one automatic response. And you can see what wins out, right? Okay. So what does that have to do with the gun violence problem? So we know that unfortunately in under-resourced urban neighborhoods in Chicago and all across the country, that the adults in these neighborhoods that normally keep a lid on things in most neighborhoods are overwhelmed. And I saw this firsthand. I'll just tell you a quick story to illustrate this. I was, when we started the crime lab, our goal was to be helpful to the city of Chicago to address this really, really big, important problem. And I realized, I spent a lot of time looking at data. I don't claim to have any idea what is really going on with gun violence, how the criminal justice system works, whatever. So I spent a huge amount of time in the Cook County Jail, in the juvenile detention center, in the court system, in schools, housing projects, you name it, and including driving around with the Chicago Police Department. So one Friday night in the summer, I'm in the Englewood neighborhood. It's about 3 miles due west of Hyde Park. It's consistently one of the most violent, lowest income neighborhoods in Chicago. Tiny neighborhood. It's like 1 mile by 1 mile. And I'm driving around with the commander in the Englewood district. We're in a police car heading along 63rd Street, one of the big commercial arteries. It's 2 lanes in both directions. I'm sitting next to the commander, he's driving, and the car in front of us starts swerving across all 4 lanes of 63rd Street, right? Far right lane in the direction that we're going, and then all the way to the far left into oncoming traffic and then back. And the commander slams on the brakes to put some more distance between us and that car. And I turned to him and I said, Commander, I think that guy's drunk. And he turned to me and he said, I do too. And I said, I was so confused, you can imagine. I said, aren't you gonna do anything? You're not just a cop, you're the cop, you're the commander of the Englewood, what are you doing? And he turned to me and he said, look, if I stopped every drunk driver in Englewood on a summer Friday night, that is literally all I would do. He said, I wouldn't have any time to deal with the real problem in Englewood, which is gun violence. And I can tell you from having spent a lot of time in police cars in Englewood on summer Friday nights, it is literally true that like you listen to the police radio, every 15 minutes, it is a shots fired call or a man with a gun call. Like they are lights and sirens, 70, 80 miles an hour over the surface streets, one gun call to a next. That is like the entire shift, right? So now imagine that you're a 15-year-old kid growing up in Englewood, right? And you're walking to school and someone stops you and demands your lunch money. All right. You learn, your system one very quickly learns that there's no adult, like you go to some adult in the neighborhood with that, they're going to be like, why are you wasting my time with this of all things, right? So your system one learns that the adaptive response to being challenged is to push back, to really push back. Notice the severity of the pushback need not be proportional to the provocation, because your pushback is not retribution for what the person just did to you. That's not backward-looking retribution. That is forward-looking signaling to everybody else in this neighborhood that you're not an easy victim, right? You are establishing deterrence retail. That's what you're doing here, right? And what the Stroop test is illustrating is a version of the Stroop test. That sort of normally adaptive automatic response might be the right thing to do most of the time, but leads to tragedy when someone's got a gun. That is the behavioral science, behavioral economics perspective of the gun violence problem. Okay, and I want to try and convince you that that's true. But before I show you some data, I want to, like, for me, the big light bulb moment was I was in the juvenile detention center on the west side of Chicago on Roosevelt Road, a couple miles due west of downtown. And we're talking to one of the, like the facility's broken up into little pods, like they've got like 15, 20 kids in a pod. We're talking to one of the staff leaders who runs one of the pods. And he says, this is him saying this. He says, look, 20% of the kids in here are psychopaths. You let them out, they're going to hurt other people. We've got no choice but to lock them up. He said, but the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here, right? So yes, there are bad people. Yes, there are bad economic conditions. But what this guy was arguing is very consistent with the behavioral economics perspective on this. A big part of this problem is normal people making regrettable decisions in very difficult 10-minute windows. Okay. So that I want to argue is what is driving this. So all I have done so far is tell you a story, right? And I think actually another kind of meta reason why we haven't made more progress on this problem is so much of our conversation about this is punditry rather than science. So I want to try and convince you with data that there is something to this hypothesis about the gun violence problem. I want to describe to you the very first exercise that my research center did when we started. So we started the crime lab back in 2008. We partnered with this amazing nonprofit in Chicago called Youth Guidance and the Chicago Public Schools to study their program called Becoming a Man. And so this is for middle school and high school age male students. We did this in some of the lowest income, highest violence neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago. This is like 10 to 12 kids. They do this once a week. Total participation is like 12 to 15 hours over the school year. They do it during the school day. They get out of class. That's part of the incentive. They bring the kids down. There's a BAM counselor. Very first exercise is the fist. They pair us up. So like Mark and I would be a pair. They would give me a rubber ball. They would say to Mark, you've got 30 seconds to get the ball from Jens's hand. The only rule is that there are no rules, go. And then after 30 seconds, they call time, they switch, and then they debrief. And so then the BAM counselor will turn to Mark and say, Mark, tell me what strategies you tried. So Mark would say something like, I started off trying to pry his hand open. And it turns out that he's stronger than he looks. In my case, that would have to be tautologically true. I couldn't get his hand open. I think I broke his pinky. Then I put him in a headlock. He still wouldn't give up the ball. I started to punch him in the stomach. I was about to bite his ear when you called time. BAM counselor says, great. Mark, why didn't you ask him for the ball? So youth guidance has now done BAM with something like 10,000 kids since we started to work with them in 2008. And what youth guidance tells us is like literally not more than a dozen kids out of 10,000 ever ask for the ball. Most of the kids in Mark's situation say some version of, oh, if I would have asked for the ball, Jens would have thought I was, and you can imagine what the kids say then. And then the kicker is the BAM counselor turns to me and says, Jens, what would you have done if Mark asked you for the ball? And most of the kids in that situation say, it's just a stupid rubber ball. I would have gladly, it's much better than having my pinky broken, being gratuitously insulted on top of that, being put in a headlock and so on, right? So what is the fist exercise doing? It is putting kids into a common situation that they see over and over again. It is triggering their normally adaptive system 1 response. It is showing them that that normally adaptive system 1 response can sometimes be overgeneralized and not be helpful. It is giving them feedback on that. And importantly, because so much of social policy is about actually engaging the people that you want to help, this is an engaging program, right? This is show, not tell about what is going on with your mind. So another way that you can kind of think about what it's doing is like, unfortunately, most of us do not learn nearly as much as we should from the experience of other people. We disproportionately need to learn things through trial and error ourselves, unfortunately, to our own misfortune, right? And so if you're a middle-aged professor and your system 1 leads you to do a bunch of dumb things, that leads to a bunch of embarrassing stories that you publish in a book. But if you're a 15-year-old kid growing up in Englewood, right, learning through trial and error is a super costly way to learn how to navigate your environment. So a different way to sort of think about what BAM is doing is it is giving kids more practice reps at life. It is putting kids in common situations that they're going to face out in the world, but they're simulated situations, so the stakes are much lower. So they're getting feedback at much lower cost. Here's yet one more way to think about what this program is doing. One of the most common findings in all of criminology is something called the age crime curve. So, imagine a graph where the x-axis is age and the y-axis is arrest rates per year. And you can see that arrest rates for people accelerate during adolescence and peak late adolescence, early 20s, and then gradually decline over the course of adulthood. Another way to think about what BAM is trying to do is be like a maturation accelerator, right? We're trying to take teenagers and push them past the peak of the age crime curve the best we can, right? That's what this program is essentially trying to do. Get kids to realize they've got a system 1 and be more skeptical of whatever it is that system 1 pops into your head. Okay, so I've just argued that this is one of the most important social policy problems in America that is proven to be enormously difficult to solve. And you're sitting there thinking, this is what's going on and this is the solution. So you are right. You are right to be skeptical. You are right to be skeptical. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and convince you. This is maybe not the right slide. I didn't realize the provost herself would be here for the. So my apologies. That's I was hoping you wouldn't be here and no one would tell on me, but that's okay. So when we're studying the BAM program, we went out and we raised as much money as we could with the mayor of Chicago's help. Even with the mayor of Chicago helping us, we couldn't raise enough money to serve even a tiny fraction of all the kids in Chicago we wanted to help. So we basically did a lottery to decide which eligible kids would get the program. And what that creates is something like a randomized controlled trial that we have in medicine, where we've got 2 groups of kids. We flipped a coin to decide which group they're in. One of the groups, they're the same on average because of the coin flip, except one group gets BAM. So if they have different subsequent outcomes, it's got to be due to the causal effect of the BAM program. And what we see is that violent crime arrests to these kids go down by fully 50%, and weapons arrests go down by 33%. If gun violence equals guns plus violence, We've got way fewer guns in their hands and way fewer violent behavior. That's an amazing outcome. So Mayor Daley had helped us raise the money. He's out of office by the time the results come in. Rahm Emanuel is the mayor. We go to the 5th floor of City Hall. I learned a bunch of new 4-letter, 7-letter, and 12-letter words myself from that meeting. The upshot of it was the mayor super excited. He's like, great, next week we're going to have a press conference at Harper High School. I'm going to announce the city's going to put a bunch of money into scaling bail. We're like, great. We're like, but Mr. Mayor, we're a bunch of economists. We are as surprised as anybody that this turns out to be so helpful. Let us just try and prove. So some of you are aware there's like a replication crisis in social science. Like, are people just p-hacking their data? We're like, we would feel a lot better if we could do a replication study. So even with the city money, we still can't serve as many kids as we would like to serve. So we basically did a lottery again, and we see the same result again. Notice this cannot be true if conventional wisdom fully explains what's going on with gun violence. BAM is not threatening anybody with harsher punishments. BAM is not waving a magic wand and ending poverty and racial segregation and social isolation and everything else in Chicago. Literally all it is doing is helping kids better understand how their own minds work in those difficult 10-minute windows, and it is generating massive changes in the gun violence problem, right? So whether this can scale is still an open question, but as a proof of concept for this perspective on the problem, this is really, really convincing that there has to be something to this view of gun violence. Okay, so what does this mean then for what to do about the problem? Okay, so let me just briefly then highlight what I think this means for public policy, and then I'll stop. I'd love people's reactions and questions and have a conversation. So I've argued that the problem is these 10-minute windows. And the problem with our policy response is that we have imagined that we can disincentivize violent behavior. Think about yourself the last time that you had like a road rage moment where you were just like literally seeing red. That is not you at your most deliberate and deterrable, right? No wonder that we have spent literally hundreds of billions of dollars over the years to try and change the incentives people face during those moments with very little impact on the problem. Okay. So I think that there are essentially two types of things that we could be doing much more of with public policy that you do not hear in any presidential debate about the gun violence problem or mayoral debate or gubernatorial debate or whatever. So one of them is these BAM-like programs that explicitly try and get kids to better understand their own minds and be more skeptical of what system one pops into their head. I also think, I argue in the book, because from spending a lot of time looking at the schooling data, I think that this is an important part of what education does implicitly, right? So think about like you're taking a math class, right? You're taking a math class and you get your homework back and you got a problem wrong and you look at it and you're like, I made some like stupid arithmetic error in solving the quadratic equation or whatever it is, right? The next time you're solving the quadratic equation for a homework or a test, you get the answer and then you do it again in the margins. Notice what education has just done there for you, right? Education has taught you that your mind can be wrong, right? You were doing the problem on autopilot. System 2 recognizes, that autopilot part of my mind that's solving the quadratic equation sometimes makes stupid mistakes. Let me double check that. All right, let me give you one more example. You're reading a book, you're reading To Kill a Mockingbird in English. You read the book, you're like, I totally know what this book is about. You come to class, you're ready to share your perspective on the book. The teacher calls on somebody else to go first. They give their perspective on the book and you're like, holy smokes, that is not at all what I took from the book. Notice what education has just done there. It has taught you that different people can see the same thing differently, right? And I mention that because I think education is doing a lot of that unintentionally. I think there's a lot of room for doing that more deliberately. Okay. Just quickly then, I think the one other thing that we can do, okay, so one thing that we can do is change what people are bringing into these 10-minute windows to reduce the risk that they instigate, they react, or they escalate. The other thing that we can do is we can increase the chances that some external force is there to step in and interrupt these 10-minute windows when they happen. So interruption rather than incentives, I think, would be essentially the behavioral economics solution of the problem. I think that's an important part of what police do. It's not just deterrence. I think they do a lot of interruption. Some of you may have been reading the newspaper about things like community violence intervention or violence interrupters. That makes no sense under conventional wisdom. In fact, I've heard violence interruption be criticized by people who think the whole problem is root causes because they're like, this is just a distraction from addressing the real problem here. This perspective on the problem gives you a way to see why violence interrupters can be really helpful. And the last piece of this that I would just mention is 60 some odd years ago, this wonderful urban planner named Jane Jacobs wrote a great book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So she's living on Hudson Street in the West Village at the time, and she's looking around and noticing that she basically had her own Greater Grand Crossing South Shore moment. She's like, I'm looking around these similarly poor neighborhoods in New York that differ dramatically in their crime rates. What's going on? She argued that crime isn't just about neighborhood poverty, it's about neighborhood vibrancy. How many eyes on the street you have out to interrupt conflict and violence. And in the 60 some odd years that Jane Jacobs wrote that, we have an accumulating body of evidence to suggest that she was right. Let me just describe very quickly one study. So some friends of mine at the University of Pennsylvania did a study. Philly, like lots of other Rust Belt cities, have tons and tons of vacant lots. We're just losing people decade after decade, lots of vacant lots. If you've been to a Rust Belt city, you know exactly what these look like. Tall grass, trash everywhere, tequila bottles, empty beer bottles, sometimes needles, sometimes empty heroin baggies, sometimes used condoms. Like these are not inviting places. If you've got one of these on your block, not inviting places to make you want to spend a lot of time outside. So they worked with the city of Philadelphia to randomly pick some of the vacant lots in Philly to clean up. Like a randomized control again, randomized control trial. The survey data show that when you clean up a vacant lot, people on that block are way more likely to be out in public. And shootings on that block go down by 30%. 30%. That is unbelievable, right? So when you look at survey data and you ask people what part of city government is responsible for addressing crime and violence, people will say the mayor's office, the courts, the police, maybe the schools. Nobody ever talks about the parks department or streets. And adding streetlights, super important. Zoning in stores in the neighborhoods to generate foot traffic, surprisingly important. So there's all of this stuff that resides in the built environment that turns out to be shockingly important for the gun violence problem and way easier to change than these other root causes that we've been focusing on for a really long time. Okay, so this is basically the argument that I wanna make is for at least 100 years, we have been thinking about the gun violence problem, and not just the gun violence problem as a system 2 problem. Like people are optimizing, how do we change incentives? And I want to argue the gun violence problem, and probably not just the gun violence problem, is driven way more by system 1 that we've appreciated, and we just need to be thinking in a very, very different way about the causes of these problems and the potential policy solutions. Thank you very much. And then I think we've got plenty of time for questions, comments, reactions.
Yes, we do. So thank you so much, Dr. Ludwig, for that presentation. At this point, I'll be opening up the Q&A session for all of our attendees in the audience. I'm going to have my colleague Karimel on that side, and I'm going to be on this side and to run the mics. If you do have a question, please make sure to raise your hands up really high, and then we'll pass that mic to you. I see a hand over there, so Karimel will pass that mic over.
Hi, Dr. Ludwig. Thanks so much. It's a great talk. And I'm a quarter away through the book, so great quarter of the book so far. I wanted to ask you what you think the mechanism is for this BAM mediation, right? So when you're telling, you're retraining system one thinking, people get this stimulus response and they react to it in a better way. But, you know, in listening to your presentation, reading the book a little bit, I thought about maybe an alternative mechanism, and that's of changing their social networks, right? So kids in this prime age of criminal behavior often have to figure out a way to get a gun. You can't just walk into a gun store when you're 14 years old, right? So being included in part of a social network is a way you'd get an illicit gun, maybe something that's stolen from someone's car or whatever, right? You have that, you carry it on you, you're threatened, you pull the gun, right? You go into a different sort of social context, then all of a sudden you're sort of divorced from that apparatus and you can't really have access. So this becomes more of a story about access to weaponry and not about changing minds.
Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe let me answer it in two parts. And the first part is what you like directly responsive to your question. So there have been lots and lots and lots of different kind of social programs that people have tried over the years that change people's social networks, right? Mentoring programs, job training programs. And like several years ago, Blueprints for Violence Prevention at the University of Colorado did a big review of 600 violence prevention studies. And of those, 30 were found to have statistically significant results at a 5% significance cutoff level. So if you are statistically inclined and you think, what is 600 divided by 5% times 600, you're thinking, boy, basically nothing works, right? So basically like we see a bunch of false positives and that's it. And so that makes me think it's got to be something else. And when we did our BAM work, one of the things that we did was to try and get at the mechanism is we had the kids play a version of the dictator game. So it's like we told the kids that they were playing the dictator game against a kid in another room. It was actually like our Confederate. And they've got $10 to, they can decide how they keep versus, how much of it they keep versus give to the other kid. The other kid will do the same. And we timed their responses. And so we've got the BAM control group and the BAM kids. And it looks like there was no difference in what the kids chose, but they take longer to choose, right? And so that is our hypothesis for what's going on. But the reason that I wanted to sort of take it in this direction as well is like my reading, I'm an economist by training, just a enthusiastic, self-taught consumer of behavioral science and psychology. My sense of the field is that like, if you have ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll recognize BAM as a variant of that. My reading of that literature is like that strand of literature developed on the clinical psychology side, and the judgment decision-making lab experiment side of the field has been largely kind of divorced from that. And I say that because like, I don't think that we really fully, deeply understand what these programs are doing, right? What we've seen in our field experiments in Chicago is that the impacts don't seem to depend on the specific curriculum, don't seem to depend on who's delivering it, don't seem to depend on the target audience. It just works over and over again. There's some sort of active ingredient, but I don't think we know exactly what that is. And I say that because I think there's a lot of important work to be done in trying to better understand that mechanism. And also partly because we see lots of other things that don't even look like BAM have the same effect, like journaling. There are randomized experiments that show that having people in jail just journal reduces recidivism. That is prompting some sort of reflection in a way that changes future behavior. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Anjali Adukia, did a study of restorative justice in the Chicago public schools. She sees that reduces violent crime arrests outside of school. Journaling and like writing a letter of apology to the person that you wronged that is generating I don't think that we really understand what that is, which means that we don't know how to turn up the dosage dial on these programs. So I think there's a lot of super important, if people are interested, like I hope that the book starts a literature rather than I hope it's not the last word on this. Maybe is the short way to say it.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll be right here.
Hi, Dr. Ludwig. I had a question about like something that earlier you brought up about like cleaning the environments that these children live in. My question had to do with the numbers that you shared. You showed how your first test run you had like quite a lot, but then on the second test run you had to lower the number of people that you could help with in that area. So like moving forward to like bigger communities and bigger areas, because this is like a poorer like socioeconomic like area. They're not like Riverside or like these areas at big cities. Like a lot of these people, they live in like smaller communities. And so I don't understand like where the funding would come from. Because even you spoke about like you came from governors and like mayors and stuff like that. So I'm just a little like curious on what your outtake would be on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great, so one of the things that I learned from working on the crime lab for the last 18 years is exactly how constrained the constrained optimization of being a mayor is. Like, I really appreciate all of the constraints that they're operating under, including financial constraints. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to think about like what you could tell a mayor who has no money. And so the reason that I was in the juvenile detention center, where the staff member told me the story about him telling the kids the 10-minute thing, is the facility had just, I went in there right after a federal judge just took it over as a result of a ACLU lawsuit. And the new administrator was like, I really want to change this place, but I don't have any money to do anything. And so he trained, so the kids would go to there's a Chicago public school facility in the building, the Nancy B. Jefferson School. The kids would go to school in the morning, and in the afternoon, they would sit in the common room of their pod watching TV while the guard stood against the wall watching the kids watch TV. So Earl Dunlap is the guy's name. He's like, I think that we can do better than 6 hours of The Simpsons. So he said, I'm going to train my guards to deliver a BAM-like program to the kids. This is not going to be the world's greatest version of BAM, he's saying, right? Because we didn't hire the guards to be good at that. I can't afford to give them more than like a week of training on this, whatever. But we saw that even that was enough to reduce recidivism among these kids that the juvenile justice system thinks are at high risk of violent behavior. That is like, so we saw like 20% reductions in recidivism at zero cost, right? That is amazing, right? Give me 5 things that reduce violence by 20% each at a cost of 0, and we've just solved the problem, right? And the other place that I've really been working very hard to think about where, like, the template for that free intervention is institution that works with lots of young people and has low opportunity cost time. And once I templatized what happened in detention, I thought about my own public school experience in New Jersey, where the state of New Jersey in its wisdom made me take 4 years of health education, where I learned that I should be eating lots more broccoli. I learned that I should be sleeping 8 hours a night. I learned that I should be avoiding alcohol. And I learned where babies come from. Super helpful. Thank you, New Jersey. When you look at the data on what the leading causes of death to American adolescents are, it's homicide, especially in low-income minority communities. It's suicide, especially in places like Palo Alto, California, right? It's car crashes and it's drug overdoses. Another term, like I've come to call those deaths of decision-making, right? This sort of thing, give us 3 weeks of the health curriculum in high school, and I think we could save a ton of lives at 0 cost. Because if detention guards can deliver this effectively, surely public school teachers could do this as well. And we are not going to be losing much with that 3-week window repurposed for this. Thank you. Other questions, comments? I don't know who I'll defer to you.
Hi there. I kind of have 2 questions, but I know you just mentioned suicide, and that has to pertain to one. I know when it comes to gun violence, suicide by firearm is something, it wasn't necessarily touched on here, but I was just wondering because you're breaking it down into system 1 versus system 2, and, suicide isn't necessarily rational, but I also wonder, does it reflect that same system 1, your split-second decision? Because, 9 times out of 10, you're going to pass away from attempting to take your life by a gun. And I don't know, that just also plays into the whole idea of, are you thinking, or is it instinctual? And how do we go about that intervention-wise too?
Great question. So there was a paper in, I think, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that came out a few years ago that showed that the median spell of suicidal ideation is like 2 or 3 hours. Right. So it's not 10 minutes, but if you've been reading the newspaper and seeing all the conversation about deaths of despair makes you think that suicidal ideation is like a persistent state. I live in a West Virginia community that has been completely hollowed out and whatever. That's very different from this idea that suicidal ideation is a temporary state. And, for the book, I tried to learn a little bit more about suicide, and I came across this amazing set of interviews with people who survived suicide attempts from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And I have some of the quotes in the last chapter of my book, and they're just so heartbreaking. One of the guys, for instance, says he jumps over the railing, and he's saying after the fact in the interview, he's like, I jumped over the railing and immediately realized everything in my life that I thought was not fixable can be fixed, except that I just jumped. Right. And you can see, really, when you think about that, that is the most heartbreaking thing that you can imagine. And thank God in this particular case, this guy survived. The survival rate, as you point out, you take a gun and you shoot yourself in the head, and the survival odds are very, very low. Right. And so that, so I think that there is the evidence is not the best evidence in the world but I think there's starting to be some indication that the same active ingredient that helps with BAM might help partially address some of the suicide problem as well. Yeah, thank you. Other questions, comments? Over here, is that okay?
I'm just wondering whether you're making a claim about the cause of gun violence or about the most visible point at which violence becomes actionable. So reactivity in the moment, reactivity explains why violence happens in the moment, but it doesn't explain why those moments are so concentrated. So I might have a chocolate cake in front of me. I might really want to eat that chocolate cake, but it doesn't explain why the chocolate cake is there in the first place. What are the conditions? So I wonder if the setup is a false dichotomy. I wonder if it's just different levels of analysis.
So I would say maybe another way to ask your question is why do Greater Grand, what is the resolution of the Greater Grand Crossing versus South Shore mystery? Might be another way to ask your question. And so I think there are two related parts to that. So, my friend Sendhil Mullainathan is an economist. He wrote a book with a psychologist named Eldar Shafir a few years ago called Scarcity, where they point out that being in stressful environments depletes mental bandwidth. And that leads people, if you think, the challenge with system 2 is that it's very mentally draining. If you are in a stressful environment and you're prone to a mental bandwidth tax, that makes you more reliant on system 1 and compromises all sorts of decision making. And if you look at the data for South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing, it sure looks to me like there are way more sources of stress in Greater Grand Crossing, even though the poverty levels are the same. For instance, there's way more graffiti, for instance, and disorder in Greater Grand Crossing than South Shore, and there's some psychology research that suggests that depletes mental bandwidth. If you look, for instance, at the COVID epidemic, that hit Greater Grand Crossing much harder than South Shore. So things like health shocks seem to affect people more in Greater Grand Crossing. So I think more mental bandwidth depletion in some neighborhoods than others is part of the story. And the other part of the story is like the Jane Jacobs phenomenon is different across neighborhoods. So if you know anything about Chicago, I mean, you know about, like, you will realize South Shore, like right now, the poverty rates are exactly the same in the two neighborhoods. But if you think about Chicago's development over the last 100 and whatever years, South Shore historically had the great advantage of being located next to the very best thing in Chicago, which is Lake Michigan. And because of that, South Shore has much more of a developed commercial corridor than Greater Grand Crossing does. So there's just way more foot traffic in South Shore than in Greater Grand Crossing, hence more eyes on the street. So like the argument that I'm trying to make here is like, and then I tell a bunch of stories about myself in Hyde Park doing dumb things. And Hyde Park is a super forgiving environment because the University of Chicago throws so much money into making it a forgiving environment. There are tons of private security driving around, security guards on every corner. It's super safe, ignore what I said before. So it's a very, very forgiving environment compared to other parts of the South Side of Chicago. And so I was saved from myself, from the universal sort of system one mistakes that we all make. Lots of other people are living in unforgiving places, hence the title of the book, that are much less forgiving of these universal features of the way our minds work. That's the argument that I'm making.
And you're saying the root cause is not the immediate reactivity, the root cause is going back to the
Yeah, exactly. But another way to say it is the set of root causes that matter, the list of root causes that matter is longer than we have appreciated. And the additions to the list are the ones that are most amenable to policy intervention compared to the things that we've been focused on for 100 years.
We have time for one more question.
I would like to ask, you said that after your first study came out, you interfaced with like the mayor of Chicago, and he said that he was like going to do a press conference and try to spread this program around the city as much, and you opted to do like more replication studies. I'm wondering if there have been any more of these programs that have been done in either Chicago or other cities in the United States, because I can't imagine like a mayoral administration that wouldn't jump on the opportunity to half youth crime. And so I'm wondering if this has been applied more.
Yeah, we've done a bunch of follow-up field experiments now with variants of BAM. So I described the one we did in the detention center with variants of BAM out in the community for kids who have effectively dropped out. Most of the shooters and the victims in Chicago are actually not teen. Like the age crime curve peaks in late adolescence, but it declines very slowly, and there are way more adults than there are teenagers. So the overwhelming majority of shooters and victims are like 18 to 35. We did a version of this with a nonprofit called Heartland Alliance in Chicago and found really amazing results with that part of the age distribution as well. I think the reason that this is not at the top of every mayor's list is because most mayors are like most Americans. Like every Chicago mayor says some version of, we're never going to end gun violence until we end poverty, right? They have the same conventional wisdom as everybody else. And the reason that I wrote the book, this is a good way to end. The reason that I wrote the book is I think we desperately need a third conventional wisdom to add to the other two to make a bunch of these policies make sense and get people to understand this is what we need to be doing lots more of. And one of the big reasons that I've been like saying yes to every place that invites me to go talk about the book is I'm trying to get more mayors and city council people and governors and people who run offices of gun violence prevention to, I think once you get the idea, the specific policies kind of write themselves. So anyway, thank you so much again for having me.